This is Financial Standard, the definitive source of news, thought leadership and analysis for Australian wealth management professionals. Financial Standard. Take the lead.
Welcome to the Financial Standard podcast. I am Karen Vergara, a senior journalist at Financial Standard, and I am joined today by Neil Macdonald, the Chief Executive of the Advisors Association. Neil, welcome.
Thanks, Karen. Lovely to meet you.
So today we are discussing Treasury opening consultations recently that proposes amending the current advisor experience pathway. So Neil, if you can please tell us firstly, what exactly are the requirements now for experienced advisors as well as new entrants?
So the current requirements is you've got to have passed an exam, you've got to have relevant qualifications by the end of December 2015, you've got to have completed ongoing continual professional development points at 40 hours a year, and then that includes an ethics component as well. The only difference for new entrants is they've got to do all of that, plus they've got to do a professional year, which is a 12-month program, which is supervised. So the proposed changes, I guess, are to recognise an experience pathway. That was originally brought up in 2021. There's been some consultation about it up to now, and quite a lot of feedback because there's a bit of a view that, to be a profession, you need to be qualified and experienced rather than just experienced. But recognising there's a shortage of advisors, numbers fallen by 10,000 over the last 3 years. There's an increasing demand from consumers with potentially 5 million people being eligible to retire in the next 10 years. There's a bit of a gap. And so this is trying to address that gap.
So within the new proposed legislation, Neil, for existing advisors that are experienced, what are the amendments in the law that will affect them?
Okay, so probably the main one is the recognition that experience is important, and that has been defined as 10 years of full-time equivalent experience. So if you were working a 4-day week, you'd have to do slightly longer than 10 years effectively. It's between January 2007 and December 2021, which actually potentially creates an issue for existing advisors because you've got to have been there for those 10 years in that period of time. And we've had a couple of advisors who've done their 10 years now, but weren't there, in 10 years in 2021. And you've got to have a clean record, which is defined as a disciplinary record and no enforceable undertakings against you. You still have to do the exam. And so, anybody who's already in the industry has done that anyway. And you've got to do your continuous professional development. And to actually become accredited under this process is you'll have to self-certify in January 2026 that you meet those requirements. And if you're licensed by an Australian Financial Services license, they'll also have to certify that as well.
For new entrants, Neil, would they still need to do the professional development, hours and requirements under the proposed new laws?
Yeah, effectively, what this proposed legislation does is to give them a little bit more flexibility in their education pathways. And so they'll still have to meet all the other requirements. So for new entrants, it doesn't really change that much.
And your association, the TAA, has read through the draft legislation and explanatory materials. What is your response to it?
Well, we've been involved all the way through the consultation process going back to 2022, and our stance has really not changed that much. The first is that we need to enable consumers to be able to access affordable advice efficiently and cost effectively. We recognise that there's a bit of a balancing act between professional qualifications and education and experience and just experience. So our preference would have been to fill the gap up to 2025 because of the question about what happens if you have disciplinary action taken between 2021 and 2025. It also creates a bit of a gap for people who have joined the industry relative in the last 10 years, but not before 2021. And our view is generally that this gap is a short-term measure that needs to be addressed more systemically by reviewing the education standards. But in the short term, we also thought that they should have a sunset clause on the experience pathway alone. What we've found as well from our perspective is we've got about just under 1,000 members. Most of them actually have just got on and done their exams, for want of a better word. And there's a bit of a sort of feeling from them that why should there be a sort of an easier pathway for some people? But I still think that it's worth doing that, particularly to ensure that consumers can get access to advice. And it's not just new consumers, it's actually existing clients, existing advisors as well.
That's a good point there. You mentioned that in the last 3 years, 10,000 advisors have left the profession. We counted from 2018 there were about 30,000 advisors practicing, active advisors at the peak. Do you think this legislation came just a little bit too late, given all the number of advisors that have exited?
I think if you look over the longer term, the trends are not that dissimilar to where they are. It's probably longer term trend is about 18,000. What you have to recall is that when the sort of reviews were done, a lot of people registered because they just wanted to make sure they were on the FAR register at that particular date. There was a lot of accountants who got registered who may not needed to have done the longer term. There's a bunch of people who might say, "Oh, look, I'm just going to hedge my bets. I'll get registered." And so there's almost two components. One is the core four, which is no doubt been exasperated by owners' compliance obligations, lots of paperwork, time to give advice, and the education standards. And then the sort of the blip, which was caused by just let's get on the register by this date, otherwise we might not get the opportunity to do so. But notwithstanding that, there is a significant fall in numbers, and this will actually help address that.
You mentioned consumers earlier. How do you think they will benefit from accessing advice with this new piece of legislation change?
In isolation, I don't think this is enough, but there's the quality advice reviews recommending other changes which make it easier to give simple advice simply. So as a package of reforms, I think it will actually make it easier for people to get advice. I think it will, for a lot of established advisors who meet this requirement, they were in a position they were going to have to retire in 2025, and now they can stay a bit longer and look after their existing clients. Many of them will be coming up to retirement age themselves as well. So I think overall it's a positive. I think at a more granular level, it does recognise that it's not a one-size-fits-all for advice. And so stockbrokers who are highly experienced would fit into this category. Life insurance specialists would probably fit into this category as well. And so it increases the number of people who are likely to stay in the industry and therefore allow different types of advice as well as just pure financial planning advice.
Absolutely agree. Neil, is there anything else you'd like to share with us regarding the new legislation?
I think the other thing which has not probably been focused on enough is the extra discretion the Minister has around education qualifications. And again, we've seen a lot of people, the pathway to get your qualifications was fairly narrow. And, we've got current examples where the title of the course has failed and therefore the exam fails. And so there's that level of discretion to allow maybe somebody who's done a bachelor's degree and then tops up with maybe a law component, which they've not done before, is a good example where it will give easier access to some people to come into the industry, get their the relevant qualifications. The gap, I still think, is somebody who's been 10 years at 2025, but not 10 years at 2021. And so in our submission, we'll be going back and suggesting that needs to be addressed. And we'll also be recommending that there should be a sunset clause on the experience pathway alone.
Neil, we've learned so much from you today. Thank you so much for joining us.
Pleasure. Happy to help.
Thanks for listening to this Financial Standard podcast. For more information, visit financialstandard.com.au. Please keep in mind that the information discussed in this podcast is general in nature and does not consider personal circumstances. Reliance should not be placed on any content without further independent financial research and advice.